Hello, folks, and welcome to today's podcast, Understanding China, Part 1, May the 4th and its implications. So, today I'm going to talk about a date that's not as widely known in the West, but should be more well known and is absolutely crucial for understanding modern China, and that's May the 4th, 1919. So, without further ado, I will, in a nutshell, answer the question, what did May the 4th, 1919 entail? Well, May the 4th, 1919 was a reaction to the Versailles Treaty. Now, the Versailles Treaty was a product of the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War. China had joined the First World War on the side of the Allies and had contributed some 96,000 labourers to the front line, 2,000 of whom had died there. So, one would expect a better term for China within the peace treaty, but that was not to be. China had supported the Allies, but China was rewarded with a slap in the face in the form of Germany's former possession of colonial possessions in Shandong province, namely Qingdao and some other territories, were not returned to China. Instead, they were simply transferred to another imperial power, Japan. Now, this was another of many rude awakenings. And this one was a particularly indignant slap in the face to the Chinese because it basically said to the Chinese nation, these guys do not take us seriously. These guys, as in the so-called great powers, Britain, USA, France, and to a lesser degree Russia, although Russia wasn't a participant in the Paris Peace Conference. So China had several rude awakenings. The first of which was the Opium War in the 1840s, and the Second Opium War in the late 1850s to early 1860s. And these had imposed upon China a series of unequal treaties. The first of which, the Treaty of Nanjing, ceded Hong Kong to the British as an indemnity for China destroying the opium that Britain was importing and selling within China. Now, we don't really need to think very hard about why this was a particularly unjust treaty. I mean, well, we all know that opium is a drug and it doesn't really have very good effects for a society. And that was why the Qing court banned it. However, this was seen as a violation. Well, the British took this as a violation of their so-called commercial rights and sent in a gunboat and forced an unequal treaty upon China, and with it territorial expropriation. Now, these treaties continued with other treaties such as the Treaty of Tianjin, and in a way the various imperial powers were set about carving China into spheres of influence, or arguably even colonies. Indeed, Shanghai had been divided among various powers, Germany, Britain and France. I've actually been to the old French concession in Shanghai. It's very clear when you walk around cities like Shanghai, you can see the former colonial presence in the form of the architecture that's still there, which in itself isn't a bad thing, but the treaties certainly were. And certainly the Versailles Treaty was not a good thing for China. Like I said, it was a slap in the face, and it said very clearly, these guys don't take us seriously. So this takes us to the question, which is the backbone of this podcast. The question is not if China needed to strengthen itself and modernise. The question was how. But one thing very clearly within the how is that China was to modernise on its own terms, not follow the whims of the West, not to follow Western customs, which inevitably would have led to China being carved up among the great powers. China had to modernise, but it had to modernise on its own terms. So, a quick overview of the main literature inspiring this podcast. The first of which is A Bitter Revolution by Oxford historian Rana Mitter, which looks very clearly at the May the 4th movement and gives us a subsequent history of China's relations with the outside world throughout the 20th century. A very good book, a very compelling read. The second of which informs much of my study of China, is former Yale historian and Professor Emeritus Jonathan D. Spence's excellent The Search for Modern China. Now, if there's one book I recommend all listeners to this podcast read, it's this. I recommend the earlier 1990 edition. I did read an updated edition from, I believe, 2005, which is somewhat abridged, which is a shame because it is a truly excellent book. And the final book, and a very heartfelt book, is Jonathan, again, the same author, Jonathan D. Spence's excellent The Gate of Heavenly Peace, The Chinese and Their Revolution. And this is in many ways a tour de force of the intellectual currents that were running throughout early 20th century China, well, throughout most of the 20th century. The intellectual currents that formed the backbone of the revolution, that were the inspiration behind China's eventual revolution, and in many ways was part of the making of modern China. So I strongly recommend Jonathan D. Spence's excellent Gate of Heavenly Peace. So what was May the 4th? Well, May the 4th saw a demonstration at Tiananmen, which, as we know, is in Beijing. Now, I say Tiananmen rather than Tiananmen Square because it wasn't a square back then. It was one of many gates, but the central gate of Beijing, the gate to the Imperial Palace, or also known as the Forbidden City in Chinese, Gugong, which is today known as the Palace Museum. This was of huge significance for China. It was believed that the emperor's power ran through the Gate of Heavenly Peace. And indeed, Tiananmen itself means Gate of Heavenly Peace. Tian, heaven, An, peace, Men, gate. You'll see many gates throughout Beijing, that many of which make subway names, such as Chongwenmen, Herpingmen, Fuxingmen, to name a few. So, useful thing to remember when you're travelling the Beijing subway. But going back to May the 4th, we see a gathering mainly of students at Tiananmen, and they were protesting the very harsh terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty. They also began to ransack and invade the houses of people who were believed to be complicit in the betrayal of China and the betrayal of China's territory in the transfer of Shandong from Germany to Japan, including the ransacking of the house of Cao Rulin, I believe his name was, an official in the court of the Republican government, who was believed to be complicit in the transfer of Shandong to Japan. So we see, what we see here is basically the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is like the culmination of all the indignities that had been forced upon China for the past near century. So first we had the two opium wars, the unequal treaties, and then in 1911 China has the first modern revolution, the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, and China had very much set itself upon a modernising path. China had ended the Qing dynasty, ended over 2,000 years of imperial monarchy, and had began its experiment with republican governance. However, the various governments from 1911 to 1919 had not really become particularly effective. So if we want to answer the question of why do these guys not take us seriously, the one answer to the question would be the lack of of central authority. China had, by this point, had entered the warlord era. It had become divided, with various sections of the country falling under warlord control, and central authority had become very weak. So, why was that? Well, first of all, the 1911 Xinhai Revolution began with an uprising in Wuchang, which is one of the free cities which makes up the modern city of Wuhan. This sparked off a series of uprisings throughout the country, and eventually the Qing court announced the abdication of the very young Emperor Puyi, and the Republic of China was established with Sun Zhongshan, or Sun Yat-sen as is commonly known in the West, as the first provisional president. Now, who was Sun Zhongshan? Now, Sun Zhongshan is one of the intellectuals, one of the modernizers, who we'll be looking at in this podcast. He was born in 1866 to a Christian family in the south of China near Guangzhou. He was raised a Christian, and he was educated in Hawaii and graduated as a medical doctor in Hong Kong. He was very much a modernizer. He lived in exile for much of his life due to his opposition to the Qing dynasty, but he led even from abroad. He effectively led the Chinese United League, a Republican opposition force that wanted to end absolute monarchy, establish a modern Chinese republic, and ultimately follow the free principles, which I believe were nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people. So Sun Zhongshan is in many ways a remarkable figure. He was the guiding force behind the 1911 revolution, and he did this effectively from overseas. As I said, he was very much a modernizer and very much a visionary. However, his term as president only lasted 3 months. He was sworn in as provisional president in January 1912, but resigned in March 1912 with little over 3 months in the job. His resignation came as a result of a compromise wherein the former Qing court and the various armies, which were previously under the command of the Qing dynasty, would only follow the authority of Yuan Shikai, a general and official in the Qing court, who was the preferred candidate of the army to be the president. Now, Yuan Shikai, I believe, only reigned less than 5 years, from 1912 to his death in 1916. However, his presidency is largely not viewed as a success. Indeed, I don't know how much of his presidency focused upon his imperial ambitions, but he's best remembered as attempting to make himself into a new emperor. He wore the imperial regalia at times and offered sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven. I mean, these are only symbolic, but what matters is that he wanted to institute a new Chinese dynasty, and that was very much not the preferred outcome of most leaders of the revolution. However, he dies of natural causes in 1916. And afterwards, we have a series of rather ineffective presidents who are unable to establish overall central authority and governance of the country. And as stated earlier, China enters the warlord era, where central authority is almost non-existent, and various provinces and regions of the nation fall under the control of warlords, many of which had foreign backing. So not only is central authority lost, it's also not a very good time for China. We have widespread poverty. We have a series of famines, including a very unpleasant famine in 1942. And China's China's modernization is essentially not going well, which is one of the reasons why people gather at Tiananmen on May the 4th, 1919, and demand that the government stand up for it, that the government stand up for China's interest and not surrender to the dictates of foreign powers. So I call this a culmination of China's renaissance, because China had been undergoing a renaissance, essentially a renewal, that's what renaissance means, for some time. Indeed, the roots of China's renaissance can be traced to the 19th century itself, where many believed that China had to strengthen itself, it had to modernize, but it had to modernize on Chinese terms. So we see many there's many thinkers and intellectuals who I could name: Liang Qichao, Chu Choubai, Kang Youwei, Ding Ling. But for the moment, I'm going to look at Kang Youwei, who is de- who is detailed very well in Jonathan D. Spence's Gate of Heavenly Peace. So Kang Youwei was born in 1860 and 1858, and he came from a relatively well-off family in the south of China, and like many of the more well-off people, he trained to sit the imperial examinations, wherein he could become a civil servant within the imperial court. So of course he has to study the Confucian classics, the prerequisite, the memorization and understanding of which was a prerequisite for success in the imperial examinations. But he's not just a scholar. He's also a visionary, and he like China experienced a rather rude awakening in 1895 while he was travelling on a Chinese steamer bound for Beijing, where he was going to sit the imperial examination. The Chinese vessel was boarded and searched by the Japanese. Now, Kang Youwei felt particular indignation to this. Why was China, which was in the 18th century the largest economy and greatest power in the world at that time, how had it reached a stage where a lesser nation, in many ways a cultural byproduct nation like Japan, could do this to China? Indeed, how could other countries like Britain and Portugal do what they did to China? And he realised a reality which was perhaps best summed up by the former US Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld: weakness is a provocation. So unfortunately, the reality is China had by this point become quite weak. As I said, central authority was lacking. Poverty was widespread. Kang Youwei wrote very vividly about the conditions on the streets of Beijing, with beggars and sick people were everywhere to be seen. But he realised that we don't have to accept this reality. China can modernise, China can strengthen itself, and it can do it on its own terms. Now, Kang Youwei had drawn as an inspiration the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, what would later become modern-day Turkey. And these were a series of imperial reforms designed to modernise the governance of the Ottoman Empire and introduce more universal education and a modern civil service and modern forms of governance. He viewed Turkey as an inspiration for this, and he was an advisor to the Qing court and an advocate of the 100 Days Reforms. Now, the 100 Days Reforms occurred in 1898, and they're called the 100 Days Reforms because they were unfortunately quashed after 100 days by the then real power in China, the Dowager Empress Cixi. the 100 Days reforms were designed to create a constitutional monarchy, popular representation within China, and abolish the death penalty, and also abolish some other rather unpleasant aspects of tradition, such as foot binding. However, well, we see the same thing happen, which happens in many countries and cultures. The old guard don't like to give up power, and that was pretty much why the Qing court, at the behest of Dowager Empress Cixi, put the kibosh on the 100 Days reforms. So, unfortunately, China finds itself here again just simply muddling through. And it was this muddling through which led to the unfortunate instance of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. So, as stated earlier, China had experienced several unequal treaties, and these treaties granted basic open-ended access of European merchants and also missionaries into the Chinese marketplace. Now, missionaries were the main objection of the Boxers within the Boxer Rebellion. Now, the Boxers were in many ways a peasant uprising, and the proper name in Chinese is the Fist Fighters of Righteous Harmony. I can't remember the exact Chinese. However, they formed something of a secret society. They were trained in martial arts, and they set about trying to limit or in some ways expel the missionaries from China. Well, the foreign powers didn't like this, and they demanded that all Boxer organisations be banned. Well, in this instance, the Qing court did show some backbone, and they said no. They said no, we're not going to suppress our own people. So the Boxers began to turn upon the foreign legation quarter, where the various representatives of the foreign powers were housed, and this led to a prolonged siege, which got to the point where they had to start killing and eating their own horses, which was actually the idea of the French, because the other foreign diplomats there weren't comfortable with the idea of eating horses. But anyway, that's a minor detail. But the main point is, the foreign diplomats were besieged in the foreign legation quarter until an international expeditionary force arrives and occupies the Forbidden City. So, or rather, the Imperial Palace. So we have another unequal treaty imposed on China, the Boxer Indemnity, which again extracted reparations from China for the Boxer uprising. And this is, I believe, the last of the unequal treaties until the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, which overthrows the imperial monarchy and establishes the Republic of China. Now, by this point, as stated earlier, imperial authority, well, rather central government authority, is weak. China has attempted to enter the world system in a responsible way, and has contributed 96,000 labourers to the Allied cause in the First World War. But again, they're treated with a slap in the face, and the Chinese can very clearly see these guys don't take us seriously. So it takes us back to how China would modernise. Now, there's many intellectual currents running through. There's the New Life movement, a movement which was designed on self-strengthening and in many ways moral purification. Adherents of the New Life movement were to abstain from alcohol and tobacco, and to abstain from sexual promiscuity. Many people were adherents of the New Life movement, including the Song sisters, Song Ailing, Song Qinglin, and Song Meiling, and the future leader of China, who comes in the mid-1920s, Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi. And we also see a renewal of various other Chinese thought, such as Kang Youwei's work Da Tong, or the Great Unity. So Kang Youwei had basically seen his ambitions for a constitutional monarchy within China quashed at the 100 Days Reforms. However, he still continued to advocate for constitutional monarchy, and he still continued to advocate for a renewal of China based upon China's own cultural traditions. And when in his work Da Tong, the Great Unity, he explores a very global role for China. He explores his vision of a globalized world, wherein you have a world community, and in some ways even a world government. But he strongly believed in China. He strongly believed in Chinese culture, and he believed that within the Great Unity, the religions which would be dominant would be Buddhism and Taoism, and Confucianism's not a religion, it's a school of thought and a moral code and a sociological school of thought, but it is very much a philosophy and very much a guiding principle. He believed these would be dominant within the future global community, and other systems such as Christianity and Islam would be lesser and possibly even fade away. Well, obviously we haven't seen this happen, but nonetheless, there is this huge plethora of students and intellectuals who believe strongly in Chinese culture, who believe strongly in China's renewal. And this can be realised, but it has to be realised on China's own terms. Now, there's many other reformers I could mention, such as Lu Xun, best known as a novelist, but he was also a reformer. Liang Qichao, but for now I'm going to look at the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, which occurs 3 years after May the 4th in 1921 in a building, I believe it was a nurse's building, or in the French Concession. I mean, I've been to the building myself. However, in a small a small building within the French Concession, a group of 12 people found the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. There's been like I say, a long period of soul searching throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, and two faculty members of Peking University, Li Dajiao and Chen Duxiu, go on to become the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, they had become that they'd read the works of Marx and Engels. I'm not sure to what extent, but they'd seen the need for China to modernize and have a more equitable and a fairer society, which again accords with the three principles of Sun Zhongshan: nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people. So, in some ways, Marxism-Leninism, with its focus upon a more equal society, common ownership of the means of production, seems appropriate for China. However, others didn't see it that way, including Marx himself when he was writing, because Marx was primarily concerned with what were then the more developed industrial societies, and he believed that a communist revolution can only be realized after having first capitalism. You have to have capitalism first before you can overthrow it and establish a communist society. And China did not yet fully have capitalism. China had many aspects of feudalism were still dominant, and China was largely an agrarian society. And the peasants as a class were not a class that Marx had taken seriously. Marx, I believe the quote is, Marx referred to the peasants as like a sack of potatoes. If my quote could be incorrect, so do forgive me. But the point is that Marx didn't take the peasantry serious as a class that could form the backbone of a revolution. But Marx didn't live in China. Marx was born in Germany, and he spent most of his life in Britain, where he studied the conditions of the working class in Britain, and that's where he composed many of his works, the culmination of which was Capital. He was writing about Britain, and also, Marx clearly, with his predictions, he predicted Britain as the country most ripe for a socialist revolution, when in fact it happened in Russia, a country, the last country he would have predicted, because again, Russia was backward. It had semi-feudalism, was not industrialization was not widespread, and he would have never predicted Russia as the country to have the first communist revolution. So if he could be wrong about Russia, well, he could certainly be wrong about China, and he was wrong about China, but it's not an error that can't be corrected, and that was an error that intellectuals such as Li Dajiao and Chen Duxiu realised, and they believed in adapting Marxism to the Chinese context, which was China is an agrarian society. If we were to have a socialist revolution and have a socialist mode of governance, we have to adapt Marxism to China's material conditions. And this program was very much underway. However, let it be noted that representatives of the Comintern were the Russian, or rather Soviet body concerned with world revolution. There were, I believe, two Soviet representatives at the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Soviet line was that industrial workers should be the backbone of the revolution, and the focus for any kind of revolutionary activity should be upon the cities, not the countryside. But again, people realise, well, hang on a minute, China is only something like 20% urban at this time. We can't really have a successful revolution in a largely agrarian society. However, some within the party, as the party was to grow, did advocate and follow the Soviet line. I believe these were called the 28 Bolsheviks, or the 28 and a half Bolsheviks. I don't know what the half means. The most prominent of which was Bo Gu, who was, I believe, served as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party for 4 years before his untimely death in a plane crash, I believe it near Yan'an or somewhere in Shanxi province. However, we see an initial division within the party over the role of classes within the revolution. Now, this was eventually resolved with the Zunyi Conference, which made Mao Zedong chairman of the party, and this is where he first gains the name by which the world would remember him, Chairman Mao. Now, Mao Zedong, we'll talk more about him later, but he was also very much he was perhaps the most prominent voice that we need. The Chinese revolution has to be based on the peasantry. It has to be based on the countryside. First of all, the countryside, we surround the villages, and the villages will surround the city, and that's how we have a revolution. But this is not. I fast forwarded to Zunyi in 1935, but it is not smooth sailing until then. So, as stated earlier, China has a series of ineffective governments, starting with Yuan Shikai, until I believe 1925, when a soldier and general by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Jieshi, launches a counter-revolutionary coup and installs himself as president, but also a military leader with the title Generalissimo. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was, I believe, from Zhejiang province, and he'd trained as a soldier. He trained as a soldier at the military academy in Baoding, Hebei province, about 1 hour from Beijing. And he was very much a leftist. He was very much a modernizer, very much a reformist. And he believed in land reform. He believed in a more equitable society. He believed in abolishing foot binding. However, what somebody believes and what they do, as we know, are very different things. He began looking to Russia, like many other Chinese, as a country which could assist China in its strengthening and modernization. Now, Russia was kind of like the least worst option at the time. Russia was an imperial power, or at least was until the 1917 revolution, but Russia had treated China a bit more fairly than the other powers. They had, after all, built the Trans-Manchurian Railway and the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they'd, in many ways, helped develop cities such as Dalian and Harbin. Indeed, if you go to Harbin, and you will see the Russian-style architecture all around you. However, Russia had also taken vast swathes of territory from China's northeast, something which, for the moment, is quietly forgotten. Well, no, I mean, it's not forgotten, but it's just not an issue at the moment. So Russia was the least worst option, and also Russia had just had a successful revolution that overthrown the Tsar and the Tsarist system and established the world's first socialist government. But it wasn't without a few hiccups along the way, particularly the Russian Civil War, wherein the White Russians, former Tsarists and Mensheviks, established a counter-revolutionary force that was assisted by outside powers such as Britain and the USA. So Russia was also something of an underdog, and China again sought solidarity with another underdog. So we first see like the Russian-Chinese alliance emerge around this time. It's not an official alliance, but it's assistance. As I said, Comintern representatives assisted and advised the Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese, or at least the Chinese who were eventually prevalent, were advocates of China doing it their way, rather than just following the Soviet model. So going back to Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek was at one point sympathetic to Marxism-Leninism, but this changed after his visit to Moscow. Now he'd sent his son there to be educated, Jiang Jingguo, who was educated at the University for the Toilers of the East in Moscow. However, I don't know the exact details of why Chiang Kai-shek developed his strong distaste for communism, but I believe I read it in Jonathan D. Spence's Search for Modern China that Chiang Kai-shek viewed Marxism-Leninism as simply Russian imperialism with a different flag. So, after his counter-revolutionary coup, one of his the most notable act was his suppression of a workers' movement in Shanghai in 1927. The details of which are horrific, but this marked the start of his annihilation campaign, his determination to stamp out communists. He famously referred to the Japanese as the disease of the skin and the communists as the disease of the heart. So, first of all, the workers' campaign in Shanghai was violently suppressed, and this led the communists, who had by this point had just generally being a workers' movement and a political movement, they realised that if we're going to survive, we need our own army. Um, uh, and this is best summed up by perhaps the most famous proverb of Mao Zedong: political power grows from the barrel of a gun. The party needed its own army, and this would become a guiding principle. The party must command the gun, and the gun must never command the party. We'd seen what happens when the gun commands the government, at least, in 1912, when Sun Yat-sen's short-lived presidency was quashed by the military insistence that Yuan Shikai be president. So if you were going to have a successful revolution, well, it can't happen without solidified political control over the military. So the communists were able to regroup in the city of Nanchang in Jiangxi province. And this is where we see the date of the founding of the PLA, August the 1st, 1927, with the Nanchang Uprising. Now, the Nanchang Uprising was an attempt to fight off the forces of the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, which was set to basically root out all communist opposition. This led to a regrouping in the countryside in Jiangxi, whereupon the first mini-Chinese socialist state was founded, the Jiangxi Soviet. I don't know what the Chinese term for this is. But at this point, China began. This is from this point as the forces of the Kuomintang are closing in on the communists. They realise they need to regroup, and this strategic regrouping becomes the Long March. Now it's called the Long March because it was, well, just that. It was long. It was 9,000 miles long throughout the south, the southwest, and the west and the central regions of China, heading through provinces such as Guizhou, Yunnan, Qinghai, and eventually reaching the revolutionary base in Yan'an. Now, it was a very tortuous, it was a very heroic expedition. I believe I've read that 90% of those who set off on the Long March didn't survive. So by this point, we have a new party, because it's essentially a new party by this point. Many former members have died on the Long March. The 28 Bolsheviks have lost power. And that takes us to Yan'an, and what would famously become the Yan'an Rectification Campaign. So the subject of that is a topic for a future podcast. But I'll just sum up the main key points of this podcast. May the 4th, 1919 was, at least in my view, the culmination of China's intellectual renaissance. It was a moment of anger, but also understandable anger, because it very clearly said these guys don't take us seriously. But it was also a moment of hope. It was a moment of optimism, and people then dared to believe that we can be taken seriously, we can stand up, we can have a seat at the nation of great powers, and eventually these people will take us seriously. We just need to strengthen ourselves first. The other point is that China's intellectual renaissance had long been running, and it had taken various forms and various experiments, whether it was the failed 100 Days Reform or the Xinhai Revolution. China had had enough. Another point is China had had enough of unequal treaties, expropriation of territory, unfair open-ended access of foreign merchants, and China was going to do something about it. And eventually the Communist Party becomes the most credible force for reunifying and strengthening China, the subject of which will be a different podcast. That's all for today. Thank you very much.